Hi everyone, Dr. Mike here. Did you know that every day your body makes 20 billion red blood cells? Every second you make 2 million. So it's a really important process because our red blood cells, also known as erythrocytes, pick up oxygen from our lungs and deliver it to the wonderful tissues of our body. Let's take a look at how this process happens. Alright, so to begin we need to understand that in order to make our nice mature red blood cells, we need a stem cell which we call a haematopoietic stem cell. Effectively, these stem cells for you and I are located in our bone marrow, specifically what we call our red bone marrow. Now you can see here I've drawn up this big long bone. Now a long bone is a bone like our humerus or our femur, and this is this is incorrect because as adults, our hematopoietic stem cells are not located in our long bones, at least not predominantly. They're located somewhere else. So let's talk about where we find these hematopoietic stem cells. But before we do that, we need to understand what the hell this thing does. Hematopoietic stem cells obviously make our red blood cells. So it's a stem cell that can turn into other types of cells such as red blood cells, but it can also turn into all the different types of blood cells. So not just red blood cells, it can also turn into white blood cells and the cell products that we call platelets, those important little clotting things. Now, I've done a video talking about the whole process of what's called haematopoiesis, making all of these blood cells. This video is just focusing on making red blood cells. But just because I like to tell you everything effectively, let's just talk about that hematopoietic stem cell. It's got two main lineages or pathways it can go down. If it goes down the myeloid progenitor pathway, it can make red blood cells. Okay, cool. But if it goes down this myeloid progenitor pathway, it can also make some other things. So it can make platelets. Platelets are those wonderful little clotting structures, fragments of cells they are, and white blood cells. Now, the white blood cells that it can make includes the neutrophils, right? Includes the monocytes, the eosinophils, the basophils, right? But you might be thinking, where are the lymphocytes? Well, great question. This is because the hematopoietic stem cell can go down another lineage. And this other lineage that it can go down doesn't produce a myeloid progenitor, but it can produce what's called a lymphoid progenitor. A lymphoid progenitor. Now, the lymphoid progenitor, that can turn into our T cells, important for the adaptive and the innate immune system, our B cells, very important for the adaptive immune system, they make antibodies, and our NK cells, which are our natural killer cells, very important cells for destroying invading pathogens. So, take home point, hematopoietic stem cells can make T cells, B cells, NK cells if it goes down the lymphoid progenitor pathway. But if it goes down the myeloid progenitor pathway, it can make all the other white blood cells and our platelets, and as we're now going to talk about, red blood cells. So, the myeloid progenitor. Going from here, its next step in making red blood cells is what we call the burst forming unit erythroid, or bfu-e. Effectively, this is the beginning of the erythroid or the erythrocyte generation lineage, right? Making red blood cells. But this is called stage one. This is the erythroid. These are effectively called erythroid progenitor cells, right? These two here. Let's write it down. It's called stage one of this process because it's the very first stage that we're actually going down a red blood cell lineage. And these are erythroid progenitor cells. So they're the first cells to make ultimately red blood cells. And the two erythroid progenitor cells are, the first one is the burst forming unit erythroid, bfu-e, and then that differentiates into the colony forming unit erythroid, cfu-e. All right, that sounds confusing. What do you need to know? Effectively, don't tell anyone, this is all you really need to know. It's called a burst forming unit erythroid because when you put them on a petri dish, right, in the lab, and look at it down a microscope, the colonies that these cells form look like they're bursting. They're multi-lobed. They look like they're bursting. Hence the name burst forming unit erythroid. Then, when they differentiate further into the colony forming, you look at them down the microscope in the petri dish, and they form smaller, nicer colonies. That's it. That's all you need to know, right? Then they move into stage 2. Stage 2 is the erythroblastic stage, and it's got many stages. So if I were to highlight which of these are the erythroblastic stage, it's going from here to here. So this is stage 2, the erythroblasts, or the erythroblastic stage. Let's go through them one by one, at least in order. So the first one is going to be the pro-erythroblast. Now, pro-erythroblast means the first erythroblast. So effectively, it's the first of this stage. It's bigger, it's got a lot of RNA. Then the pro-erythroblast turns into a basophilic erythroblast. Now, basophilic means blue-loving. Now, that's because if you put a particular dye on it, under the microscope, this looks blue. All right, then that turns into a polychromic erythroblast, and polychromic means many colors. That's important because not only under the microscope does it look blue, but also looks pink. And that pink that's coming through now is because it's starting to accumulate hemoglobin. That's what the pink is representing. Then it goes from a polychromic erythroblast to an orthochromic erythroblast, or orthochromatic, I should say. Sorry, I said chromic, orthochromatic, polychromatic and orthochromatic. Orthochromatic means true or correct color. This is now pink because it's filled with hemoglobin. Beautiful. So what's happening in this stage 2? Well, one of the things that I just highlighted is we're starting to synthesize and accumulate hemoglobin. Now, I'm from Australia, so that's how I write heme, just so you know. Not a misspelling. For me, correct spelling. So we're synthesizing and accumulating hemoglobin in this blastic stage, erythroblastic stage. But what we're also doing is we're getting rid of our organelles, you know, things like the mitochondria and the endoplasmic reticulum and so forth, but we're also getting rid of our nuclei. So basically it's extruding, spitting out the nuclei. And I'm going to talk about that in a sec. So these are important steps. I'm going to talk about synthesizing this hemoglobin shortly, but I want to talk about this process a bit more generally. If you look under a microscope in the bone marrow itself, all right, I'll get back to that in a sec. If you look under the microscope in the bone marrow itself, what we're going to see is this. For this stage, you have this center macrophage, right? Macrophages are big eaters. There's our macrophage. I'll write that down. There's our macrophage, big eater. And what this macrophage is surrounded by are all of these erythroblastic cells at different stages, right? So you have all of these erythroblastic cells. Some are bigger, some are smaller, they all look different because they're all under different stages. Effectively, what this whole thing is called is an erythroblastic island. This is called an erythroblastic island. And again, it has a macrophage at the center and all these blastic cells around it maturing. The macrophage helps regulate the process. And it does this by doing a couple of things. One, the macrophage will take in and gobble up the nucleus. So it takes in, gobbles up the nucleus. So when that nuclei is exuded from these blastic cells, gobble, gobble, gobble. But what the macrophage also does is it hands off, importantly, the iron that's needed to make hemoglobin, right? The iron that's needed. So this erythroblastic iron, very important in regulating the process. Let's talk a little bit about what we need to make hemoglobin, and we'll come back to it in a sec as well. Because there's so much it's all fun, isn't it? All right, we need iron to make hemoglobin because hemoglobin is made up of heme and globin, and the iron helps carry the oxygen. We also need vitamin B12, which is also known as cobalamin, and we need vitamin B9, which is known as folate. And we also need globin chains. These are amino acid chains. Now, what we need are these chains to be alpha and beta chains. They're the chains that we need. So, during this erythroblastic stage, we need iron, B12, B9, and globin chains. The iron's important, I said it carries the oxygen. B12 and B9, that's important for DNA synthesis. Now, you might think, okay, but the whole body needs DNA synthesis. Why is it so important here? We don't talk about it elsewhere. Well, think about it. These red blood cells that we're ultimately making, we make 2 million a second, right? 20 billion a day. So this cell's very dependent on DNA synthesis and therefore very dependent on these two. And the globin chains. Now, if we're deficient in any of these things, it means that we don't make hemoglobin. We don't carry the oxygen. We don't have mature red blood cells. This is called anemia. Anemia is a reduction in the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, often due to reduced hemoglobin or reduced red blood cells, potentially both. And a reduction in any of these things can cause that. I'll get back to that in a second. All right, after the erythroblastic stage, we go into what's called the reticulocyte. So the reticulocyte is an immature red blood cell. It's exuded the nuclei and its organelles, but it's got a bit of RNA left. So it's got some ribosomic residue left over. And that makes it look like a network. And that's where the term reticulo comes into play. Reticulo means network. So it looks like a network of RNA remaining. Reticulocytes, importantly, can jump into the bloodstream. This is the first of all of these developing blood cells that jump into the bloodstream. So effectively, you have two red blood cell types in your bloodstream. An immature red blood cell called a reticulocyte, which, like I said, has RNA, and a mature erythrocyte. No nuclei or no nucleus, no organelles, no RNA, packed full of hemoglobin. And it's got that nice biconcave structure to it. Now, the reason why this is important clinically is this. Think about this process. If something was gobbling up our mature red blood cells, right? We had something that was targeting them for early destruction and our red blood cell numbers went down. Our body would go, oh crap, we need to make more red blood cells. So it stimulates this process to happen, which ultimately would mean you'd have more reticulocytes. So when your mature red blood cells go down because something's gobbling it up, you would expect to see an increase in the reticulocyte number to make up for it. Now, generally in healthy people, the reticulocyte number is low because once it's in the bloodstream, it only takes about 1 to 2 days to turn into a mature erythrocyte. So most of the reticulocytes in the blood have already converted to a mature erythrocyte. That's in healthy individuals. But if that's getting knocked on the head, that's going to be high. So if you have a look in the blood, because remember, you can sample blood easily, measure these things, can't sample the bone marrow easily to see what's going on here, right? So you test the blood, you go, oh, red blood cells are low, but the reticulocytes are high. That tells me something's knocking them on the head and the bone marrow is trying to compensate. That makes sense, cool. So it gives you an indication what might be happening. What if you measured the blood, that was low and the reticulocytes? So red blood cells are low and reticulocytes are low. Well, that might tell you that it's not getting knocked on the head here, but it's getting knocked on the head early on. Something might be happening in the bone marrow. And that then tells you, let's take a look. There might be some form of cancer happening within the bone marrow. So that's a nice indication simply just from measuring the blood. All right, something I need to talk about importantly before I talk about this is that I said to you that the haematopoietic stem cells, this is something I alluded to earlier, are located in our bone marrow. And I said I've drawn up a nice long bone like our humerus and femur. But our haematopoietic stem cells as adults aren't located here. Where are they located? Well, let's first start off by talking about embryonic development. So as a developing embryo, from around about week 1 to week 6, right? Your haematopoietic stem cells, and therefore your body's ability to make blood cells, that's in your yolk sac. And you might be thinking, what the hell is a yolk sac? So from about weeks 1 to 2 as a developing embryo, you have like this balloon next to you that can turn into certain structures as you develop it, but also it produces our blood cells, at least for an embryo. But once we hit weeks 6 to round about weeks 28, so from week 6 onwards to 28, it's not the yolk sac's responsibility to make blood cells, it ends up being the responsibility of the spleen and the liver. Now, early on, it's mostly the spleen, and then later on, it's mostly the liver. And then from 28 weeks onwards, right, it ends up being our bone marrow. From 28 weeks onwards, our bone marrow. Now, specifically, our long bones, like the ones I've drawn up here. That is until we hit adolescence. And from adolescence to adulthood, it moves from being in our long bones. So the hematopoietic stem cells are still in our bone marrow, but they're no longer in our long bones. They're in our axial skeleton. And you might be thinking, what's that? Well, our axial skeleton is our skull, our vertebrae, our sternum, our rib cage, and our pelvis. So this is where, for you and I, most of our hematopoietic stem cells are located and most of our blood cells are produced. So very important point. All right, let's rewind back and go here. Reason why I want to talk about this a little bit more is because of anemias. So I highlighted to you before that when your oxygen carrying capacity is low due to low hemoglobin or low red blood cells, that's called anemia. And you can have different types. So you can have, if you don't get enough iron in your diet, an iron deficiency anemia. If you don't have enough B12 or B9, you can have a deficiency, an anemia here as well. If you don't have enough of if you don't get enough amino acids potentially from your diet, that's theoretically possible. Or if you've got mutations in these globin chains, they can result in something called thalassemia or sickle cell anemia. Again, so it makes sense, right? If you alter these structures or you don't have enough of the primary components, iron, B12 and B9, you don't make enough hemoglobin, you don't carry enough oxygen, you can get anemia, all right? Final point is this. What stimulates this stage 1 to start pushing forward? A really potent stimulator of this is EPO, which is also known as erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is a chemical that's produced from the kidneys that stimulates these erythroid progenitor cells to start moving forward. Now, in what instance would you trigger this process to happen? Well, ultimately, the only job of red blood cells is carrying gases, oxygen, right? So if our oxygen levels are low, if we have low oxygen levels in the blood, it makes sense that it would trigger EPO to be released, triggering this process. But the question is, where is EPO released from? And the answer is the kidneys. Now, I don't have much room here, so I'm going to draw it down here. Firstly, it's really strange to think our kidneys are responsible for red blood cell production, particularly when we know that it's happening in our bone marrow. Why? Our kidneys, one of its primary roles is to filter the blood. And it has to filter 120 milliliters of blood every minute just to stay on top of things. And when it does this, it tastes or measures what's in the blood, which means this is a great structure to measure the oxygen in the blood, right? And so that's why it's being given to the kidneys. So if we were to draw a kidney up, right? Here's a kidney. You know that you've got the cortex of your kidney, which is the outer few millimeters, right? There's the kidney cortex. In the cortex, we have what's called our nephrons. These are the filtration units. So if I were to draw up a nephron, it's got like this Pac-Man or snake head, and it's got this body like this. And effectively, blood will enter, turn into this little bloody ball of yarn, and then blood will exit, right? So blood will enter, and this is where the blood gets filtered. These are called the tubules of the kidneys, and whatever stays in the tubules all the way to the end, that comes out as pee, right? But we have, surrounding these tubules, we've got cells, right? They're called tubular cells or peritubular cells or peritubular epithelia. The thing is that under the microscope, the nephron isn't linear like this. these tubules are all wrapped around each other. And effectively, between these cells, right, between these peritubular cells, you've got other cells called interstitial cells. So I've got some interstitial cells here. These are called the peritubular interstitial cells, and they are what release, they pick up the drop in oxygen, and they are what release the EPO, the peritubular cells. All right, why am I telling you this? It's because some people get what's called chronic kidney disease. Chronic kidney disease can result in fibrosis of the interstitial cells, which means they get knocked on the head. If they get knocked on the head, they don't make EPO, and if they don't make EPO, they're not very good at responding to make new red blood cells, and they can get a renal anemia. So again, another anemia. So this is just an overview of the process of erythropoiesis, making those wonderful red blood cells. I'm Dr. Mike, and I hope that helped. Hi everyone, Dr. Mike here. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe. We've got hundreds of others just like this. If you want to contact us, please do so on social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Dr. Mike Todorovic, at DrMiketodorovic. Speak to you soon.